Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Friday, April 4th, day 546 of the war. Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our diplomatic reporter, Laser Berman, who is joining us from Budapest. Hi, Laser. Thanks for taking the time today.
Good morning, Amanda.
We are going to hear updates about the ongoing Qatar Gate investigation, now with Qatar's input, as well as we'll hear about the fallout from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's trip to Hungary so far. Please stay tuned after our newsy shorter daily briefing today for a full installment of our Friday Focus, which zeroes in on the bromances between the Israeli Prime Minister and leaders of some of Europe's more anti-liberal democracies. Okay, Laser, let's start with Qatar Gate, and let's actually begin with what we're hearing from Qatar.
Well, in this first official statement from Qatar about the growing Qatar Gate scandal, not surprisingly, Qatar says it didn't do it, but I think there's some details in their statement which are worth discussing. They say the statements were published by, quote, some journalists and media alleging that Qatar made financial payments to undermine negotiations, to harm Egypt. Well, it's not just some journalists and media. It's the Shin Bet and the police that believe this might have happened. So that's, first of all, not true in the way that they're presenting it. And they say that the allegations are, quote, baseless and serve to only the agendas of those who seek to sabotage the mediation efforts and undermine relations between nations. And it also doesn't really fit the political reality in Israel. They're saying what the Shin Bet and those who are criticizing in the streets Prime Minister Netanyahu really want to sabotage mediation efforts, and the people that are protesting for a comprehensive deal to let all the hostages out, even at the expense of leaving Hamas in a position to retake power, really want to undermine mediation efforts. It's just utterly unconvincing. And no one's, doing this. I'm sure there's a lot of mistrust of Qatar, but just because they want to undermine relations between nations. It would be more convincing if they said some people are doing this because, they're looking for something to pin on Netanyahu because they don't like him. They want to get him out of office, or probably most people are very concerned about the idea that a country that is quite questionable and is quite problematic in many ways is potentially affecting people or paying people very close to the decision makers during a war, and could even be affecting Israel's decisions on hostage negotiations on the war, also at an expense of one of our most important security partners in the world, Egypt. So I really am utterly unconvinced by the statement by Qatar.
Okay, now let's come back to the investigation itself. And yesterday, the courts extended the remand of Feldstein and Jonatan, Urich, the two aides to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who are key suspects in the ongoing Qatar Gate probe. They apparently got into a heated argument during a joint interrogation this week. Now, the two men are suspected of having taken money from Qatar to spread pro-Qatari messaging to reporters while in the Prime Minister's employ. So what further developments did we see yesterday in the investigation?
So we're starting to see journalists being questioned by the police. Now, these start as open in testimonies, meaning they're not suspected of anything. They're giving more information. We saw Suleiman Maswadeh of Kan Hadashot, of the Kan public broadcaster, Shirit Avitan Cohen of Israel Hayom, and Tzvika Klein. Now, with Tzvika Klein, according to what he wrote, he's the chief editor of Jerusalem Post. According to what he wrote on Twitter, he was initially summoned to give this open testimony. And then while he was there, he was told by the police that he was now being questioned or interrogated under caution, meaning he's starting to become a suspect. He says without a warrant, without any explanation, his phone was taken away. He was held for 12 hours, barely any food, couldn't speak to his wife. That is also quite disturbing, separate from the whole Qatar Gate allegations, but to bring anyone in, any citizen in, and then once they're there to tell them that they can't leave is very problematic, especially when it's a journalist and they're being questioned about their work as a journalist. It really does not sit well with me. I would just say, when you're going to speak to police, first of all, if you don't have to, don't have to. But if you do go, take a lawyer with you. Absolutely. I think it's somewhat naive to think that you're just going to give some information to the police and everything will be fine. You can see what happened to Tzvika Klein, or at least what he alleges happened. He was brought in under different pretenses, and all of a sudden, while he's there, it switches to a very different type of conversation, and he's actually held there and has his phone taken away. So, absolutely disturbing in that way as well.
Before we delve into the news from Netanyahu's visit to Budapest, can you give us a sense of the pomp and circumstance that greeted him?
Oh, it was quite impressive. We're in Buda Castle in the National Gallery on the Buda side of the river. Budapest is split into two sides. You have the Danube River in the middle, so this overlooks it. So first of all, on just the drive across the river, the main bridges have Israeli and Hungarian flags. There's massive Israeli and Hungarian flags up on the hill where the castle is. The whole city can see it. All the tourists that are here can see these Israeli flags. And inside the castle itself, in this courtyard, you had two sets of cavalry units who were dressed kind of in 19th century gear with some very impressive mustaches, white and brown horses. And you had about 100 soldiers also as an honor guard and a military band. So when Netanyahu came in, they all kind of paraded, got into place, and then Netanyahu and Orban, as the band was playing, inspected the troops, and then the military band played Hatikva, Hungary's national anthem. So it was quite noticeable and quite impressive.
On a more serious note, yesterday, alongside Bibi's visit, Budapest announced that it is withdrawing from the International Criminal Court. So Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is, of course, the subject of an ICC arrest warrant, and Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban vowed not to enforce it, already before the trip, of course. So this announcement came as no surprise, but of course, the fallout is just beginning. So what kind of response has so far been expressed on the international stage?
Well, predictably, there's been anger where you expect there's anger. The Palestinian Authority, which has no influence over this at all, certainly not in Hungary, called on Orban in Hungary to arrest Netanyahu. Not going to happen. Germany, which is a little bit more concerning, given Germany's place, given the fact that it's really Israel's second most important ally in the world, and the fact of the history there, said it was a sad day for international law, the fact that Netanyahu walked around and wasn't arrested. So that was Germany's foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, who said that. But also, I think more importantly, Trump was excited about it. The two of them spoke to President Trump, and according to Israel, spoke about further ways or next steps on this issue. So that's important, and it shows that there's this emerging alliance of these right-wing, you can call them anti-liberal, democratically elected leaders, of which Trump is one, and Orban, and you could say Netanyahu as well. And the fact that they are coalescing into a group, that talks to each other and that can cooperate on other things, I think that's very significant as well.
Thanks so much for joining me today, Laser.
Thanks, Amanda.
Shabbat Shalom. And listeners, please stay tuned for another episode, a full installment of our Friday Focus. Laser and I talk about all things Hungarian and all things bromance between our Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, and some of these anti-liberal democracies, especially in Europe. Stay tuned. Welcome to the Times of Israel's Friday Focus. You're listening on April 4th, day 546 of the war. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan, here with our diplomatic reporter, Laser Berman, who today, we're recording a little early, today on Wednesday, is about to jet off to Hungary. Laser, are you all packed up?
Not even close, but I don't take very long. I have to go home after this. About 15 minutes I'll be packed. Then head to the airport where I'll be flying with Prime Minister Netanyahu.
Excellent. So we are going to speak about what Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu seeks to accomplish in Hungary. We'll also talk about Israel's relationship with Hungary in general and Netanyahu's bromances with some of the leaders of what could be called anti-liberal countries or anti-liberal democracies, specifically in Europe, but not just. And most importantly, we'll find out just how many packets of Hungarian paprika Laser is bringing home for me. All of this and more when we're back. So, Laser, the burning question of how much paprika we'll get to at the end, but what usually happens when you set off on a trip with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu? Give us a little sense of color and what happens on these flights on, what's the airplane called now? Wings of Zion or something like that?
Wing of Zion. It has two wings, but it is Kanaf Zion in the singular, Wing of Zion.
Excellent. So tell us, you get to the airport and then what happens? Just briefly take us through what's awaiting you today.
Journalists get there about 3 hours before the set takeoff time. I believe there's about 15 to 20 journalists this time. The last trip we had was to DC, where Netanyahu met Trump. This is going to be a shorter trip. It'll go from Wednesday night to Sunday. So once again, Prime Minister Netanyahu is staying over Shabbat, something that kind of irks me because it's done at the taxpayer expense with no, official meetings happening over Shabbat. You take a bus from the airport to a special part of the airport where the plane is waiting. You're usually on that bus with Netanyahu's top advisors. So his diplomatic advisor, Gal Hirsch, who's the representative or the point man on the hostages, his spokesman. So a lot of the senior people that you like to get FaceTime with, the bus and kind of waiting around is an important time to do that. And then you get to the plane, drop your bags in the journalist section at the back of Netanyahu's plane, and then you come down and wait for him to show up in his limousines. He'll usually come out, give a short statement, often in Hebrew, then English, to the press, get on the plane, and then off we go. It'll be a short flight, 3 hours, land early morning Thursday, right to the hotels, and then Thursday is going to be the main day where he'll meet Prime Minister Viktor Orban.
Okay, so let's talk about what Netanyahu hopes to accomplish and why Hungary. I mean, there's so much going on here in Israel. Of course, there's the war, there's the hostages, there's his corruption trial, there's Qatar Gate. There's no lack of things to do for Netanyahu here in the country. So why go to Hungary right now?
So there's a bigger question, I guess, is why go abroad? To do all the things we want to do in Israel, whether it's to prosecute the war, to have a thriving economy, and to do all the other things a normal state does. Obviously, you need to take care of your diplomatic relations. I think no one asked questions when he went to the United States. It's clear the United States' impact on winning the war, diplomacy, the economy, and a host of other issues. So it seems like the question needs to be asked here. Hungary is not a major power. It's not even one of the most powerful countries in the EU. So of all countries, why not Germany? Why not France? Why not the UK? First of all, Netanyahu was somewhat limited to where he can go. There was the International Criminal Court in The Hague, which issued arrest warrants for him and for former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. Those arrest warrants are still relevant. They still would require countries that have signed on to the statute to arrest Netanyahu. So that limits the countries he is going to go to and he is going to take a risk at. And a lot of countries don't want to be in the position of being forced to either arrest the prime minister of an allied country or to basically undermine the ICC. But some countries have actually come out and said that they would not arrest a democratically elected leader of an allied country. Hungary said that very clearly, invited Netanyahu, and I think this is primarily a way to thumb his nose at the ICC, to say that, look, I can wander around in Europe, in the EU, and no one's going to touch me, so your arrest warrant is really worth nothing.
Yeah, and it's not as if we have gazillion million allies in Europe right now, especially in the EU. And Hungary has been a big ally of Israel, specifically perhaps when Netanyahu is in office. I don't know how it was when Bennett and Lapid were in office very briefly, but this bromance between Israel's leader and Hungary's leader just seems to have flourished and is, long lasting, it appears to me.
So first of all, I wouldn't say that we don't have allies in the EU. Almost every EU country is a friendly country with whom we have different levels of cooperation. What really gets in the way of, full friendly relations is the Palestinian issue, and different countries are differently obsessed with it. So, we've talked about Ireland, Spain, Norway, which recognized a Palestinian state. Ireland, I think most of all, has this kind of across-the-wall obsession with the Palestinian issue that gets in the way of relations, up to us closing our embassy and calling the government anti-Semitic. But countries that I think are somewhat problematic at times, like France, that's still a country we have a deep security relationship with. Our top officials talk to them all the time, visits, everything like that. So even the countries that are somewhat problematic are still close allies. And then there's countries like Germany, which is probably our second most important strategic partner. And then there's other countries that are in this Central European bloc, like Hungary, like Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, often, even though we have fights with them over Holocaust memory, Moldova. So there's plenty of countries that are quite friendly and quite reliable for Israel. But Hungary, like you said, stands out in its reliability, in its outspokenness, in its willingness to use the fact that the EU in foreign policy is a consensus organization. It needs the full support of 27 member states. Therefore, one country like Hungary has a lot of ability to hold up or to change what foreign policy decisions are made. And Hungary has shown a willingness to do that.
It was pointed out to me by my assistant, Yakov Schwartz, who lives in Budapest, that Hungary also seems to have a lot of intelligence cooperation with Israel. And indeed, it was one of the countries that was used during this, extremely high-profile pager operation against Hezbollah. So would you say that Hungary also stands out in this way, Laser?
I wouldn't say it's necessary. I mean, its capabilities are certainly not what the UK, what France and Germany has, and the cooperation there is quite tight as well. But there is cooperation across the board. Hungary sees Israel, and Orban sees Netanyahu as a sister state in many ways. What do I mean by that? If you want to get away from the political for a second, you say, why is there this instinct among Hungarians to shy away from post-nationalism that we might see in Brussels and a lot of Western European countries? There's this distrust of nationalism that came about in Europe after World War II, and part of the European project, which ultimately, after several iterations, resulted in the EU in the 1990s, was this belief that nationalism and would lead to inevitable wars in Europe, and the way to get away from those darker forces that lurk beneath the surface in Europe is to have post-nationalism and cooperation in institutions like the EU. And they believe that is what has led to peace and prosperity in the continent after the horrors of World War I and World War II. Hungary sees itself as a unique culture, so it's not related linguistically to its neighbors. It has, a strong belief in its own culture, a desire to promote it, to protect it. It's seen historically Hungarian lands being put into or taken or cut off and resulting in Hungarians living under other countries. That has led to tensions at times with even Ukraine. And it is a proudly nationalist country that wants to protect its culture against what it sees as a post-nationalist, even a post-Christian Europe. And when it looks to Israel, it sees a country that has been quite successful, a proudly nationalist country, a country that is different than its neighbors, that's unique, that has a unique language, that acts differently than its neighbors. And it says, okay, they would understand this is kind of a model country for us, a prosperous country too, but certainly a Western country that would understand why we cling on to nationalism and why we think that is the way forward. So that's kind of a deeper reason for them to be positively oriented toward Israel. But there's other reasons as well. I mean, the European project is certainly going through some serious shakeup. You can see the wave of populism, which started more than a decade ago, you can even say 2 decades ago, and got stronger and stronger over the years. Some things that have certainly pushed it is the migrant and the immigration policies of the European Union. If you remember, in the Syrian civil war, in the wake of the Arab Spring, Europe opened its doors to hundreds of thousands of young men, primarily, but plenty of Muslim immigrants into Western Europe. Hungary and other Central and Eastern European countries did not accept any of them, and we're proud of that. And Hungary actually built a wall on its southern border. And you can see that has led to some serious public dissatisfaction in Western Europe. You see that many countries which had promoted this, this asylum seeking and these EU open borders are now turning against it. You have Germany, which is announcing that there's going to be border checks at all of its borders, which goes against the Schengen zone principle. You have Poland also defying EU rules and saying that they're going to stop EU asylum seekers if they come from Belarus or something, that they're going to get sent back. So this is certainly something that is leading to this populist right-wing, or you can call it far-right pushback in the EU. These parties won in the 2024 European Parliament election. So this is really the strongest force now in EU politics, is the right-wing populists. But there are also other issues. The European economy is, after, let's say in 2000, it was basically on par with the US. The US has grown twice as fast. Energy prices are at least twice as high across the EU, and some countries much worse. It is seen as an over-regulated, a non-innovative block of countries where it has all the potential, but regulation, because of a determination to actually implement, these net zero visions, which I think is totally unrealistic, and I think voters do as well, and countries are moving away from it. Over-regulation in a number of ways as well has meant that if you take, let's say, the 50 leading tech firms in the world, only 4 of them are in the EU. So there's a stagnation, there's a rising cost of living and inflation, and a feeling that there's not the economic dynamism, and it is going to take years, if not decades, to get back on par with the United States, which has much, much cheaper energy, which has a much more dynamic economy, which has much fewer regulations, and is moving to even fewer regulations with Donald Trump. And then you add on top of that the need for Europe to come to some sort of decision about how it wants to defend itself, given that the reliance on the U.S. is something that is not as solid as it was. It could be that the U.S. will even declare that it won't defend Europe, and it needs to reindustrialize and build a defense base, and that it just doesn't have the capacity right now to do it. It doesn't have the money to, it doesn't have the demographics to do it, it doesn't have the factories to do it. So these are all very, very thorny questions. And the votes that you've seen both within EU countries and at the Brussels level, kind of the European Parliament level, I think points in the fact that the classic EU project, which is this faith in these transnational or post-national institutions, is the past, and that Europe has to think about what it wants its future to be, and that future is going to be something far more in line with what Hungary and the right edge of European politics would want than the classic parties and the classic people that have been, let's call the Europhiles, have wanted. So this is all being shaken up on the continent, and then this is certainly affecting Israel's relationships with the EU, also Trump's relationships with the European Union.
Okay, so much to unpack in what you said. And Hungary, of course, isn't all on board with the EU. It has its own currency still. It's very much an independent voice, as you said, on the migrant issue, ahead of its time, shall we say, for much of Europe, which is catching up now, as you just talked about. I also want to talk about its past a little bit, and it had been quite linked to Russia for decades, of course, and after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia's influence was still there, including, of course, in military training throughout the decades. And Hungary's location, of course, is along one of its borders is alongside Ukraine. So this constellation is also quite interesting. I don't know how much of a role Israel or Netanyahu can play in terms of this triangulation of Ukraine, Hungary, Russia. Do you have any thoughts about this at all?
Yeah, so when we look at Ukrainian history and how it affects the way we should look at Ukraine today, I think there are three elements that get talked about. One is kind of this anti-liberalism that Hungary had after, the 1990s, early 2000s, had its blossoming of democracy. But before that, it was in the Soviet bloc. It was kind of the most prosperous of the Soviet bloc countries, but it was certainly didn't have, these nascent democratic institutions growing like you can say in Poland that you saw. Another one is the question of anti-Semitism. The Hungarian regime was by 44 was actively cooperating with the Nazis and sending Jews to Auschwitz. Had a series of anti-Semitic laws on the books in the 20s and 30s. And that question is, how deep is that in society and how should that be remembered? That is absolutely something that is a concern in today's Orban's Hungary. And then you see the campaigns using George Soros, who's a Hungarian-American businessman on the left, who is being used in campaign ads. And the question is whether that use of him behind all of these European projects and these liberal projects feeds right-wing anti-Semitism that sees Jewish hands behind these world issues. That's certainly been a criticism. And then the other one, which is very, very salient for Europeans and not salient at all for Israel, is Hungary's policies on the Ukraine war. Like I said, Hungary and Ukraine had some pretty strained relations in the past, including over the Hungarian minority in Ukraine, and a close relationship between Orban and Putin. Throughout the war, Hungary has blocked some EU action, sanctions, or allowing Sweden into the EU at different times. Now, if you ask the Hungarians, they'll say, listen, we are on the front lines. We know what Russia is. We fought against Russia in the 50s. Okay? No one can criticize us for buying Russian gas because look what Germany did. And look at Europe still continues to spend a ton of money on Russian fossil fuels. So no one can lecture us. First of all, we have to think about what's good for Hungarian citizens. This war is good for nobody. We don't want the war to spread into Ukraine and to the rest of Europe. That's not going to be good for anybody. We've taken in a ton of refugees. We've cooperated with Ukraine in a number of ways. We're on the front line. We're on the NATO front lines. Ukraine isn't in NATO. We're on the NATO front lines. And by the way, if you make us buy less gas from Russia, well, we're supplying Russian gas to Ukraine. Who do you think we're going to shut it off to? We're going to shut it off to Ukraine because we have a responsibility to our own citizens. So they would put it in that way and call many European countries hypocrites for their own Russian policies and their own policies around the war, and say that they are not as threatened as Hungary is. But other countries say, listen, we are trying to come up with a deterrent and effective sanctions against Russia. Hungary is working Orban is working as Putin's ally within the EU. He's blocking effective action, Western action, and he is undermining the West and helping Putin continue his war. So that is the war of narratives there. Also on the Sweden issue, Hungary says we're happy to expand NATO. We're happy to have Sweden come in, but it was a bilateral issue. Because Sweden was attacking Hungarian democracy, we need to solve those bilateral issues. And also Hungary is very concerned about sanctions from the EU over democratic backsliding, and it wants relief there as well. And this is one way for it to have leverage there. So you'll hear different versions. I just want to say that the Hungarian diplomats that I've interacted with are some of the best diplomats I've seen. They're available. They're eloquent. They know how to speak to the media, and they know how to explain their case. So there is definitely, a case to be made for many of Hungary's policies. Not that Europe wants to hear it,
But I think Israel is far more open to that because, Israel's policy in Europe, I think, can be comparable to Hungary's in many ways. It's less our fight than Hungary's is, but we're not going to pick a fight with Russia. We have interests with Russia. We certainly are quite sympathetic with Ukraine. We know who the aggressor is, but we're not going to cut off ties with Russia or move too far and harm our own interests in a war which does not directly affect us.
Right. So part of my question is, in Netanyahu going to Hungary for this long weekend, is part of the hope to actually get closer to Russia or to maintain, good relations or some good channels with Putin? Do you think that Orban can be this mediator in a way?
I don't think we need other countries to talk to Russia. We know how to talk to Russia. We've always been talking to Russia, certainly about Syria. And there are enough ways to talk to Russia, and we've been able to do that. I think this is about the ICC. This is also about the EU and coordinating on EU policies and making sure that the Visegrad group, those Central European countries, are continuing to support Israel within the EU. But I think the main thing here, and this is what lurks over all of Israeli policy since Trump came back to office, is Trump. Trump and Orban have a good relationship. It's a natural alliance as well. And for the Netanyahu, Orban, Trump triangle, I think is going to be a very active and fruitful one for Israel as well. Certainly not an illegitimate one. If someone says that, Israel shouldn't be talking to countries where there's concerns about democratic backsliding or electoral authoritarianism or whatever critics of Hungary want to say, well, guess what? Every country in the world has wonderful relations with actual non-democratic countries. We have long-standing and important relationships with Egypt, Jordan. It's not like the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco are, paragons of liberal democracy. And Europe certainly has relations with Iran and other countries as well, and many of them are still in Russia. So there's nothing that is wrong with having diplomatic relations for your own interests with countries that there's concern about, some democratic norms at all. I think we have to make sure that we're not alienate. We don't want to get too involved in, the internal Hungarian issue because we don't want to alienate the Democrats in the U.S. where there's already slipping support, and we certainly don't want to alienate important allies in the EU and seem like we are getting involved in internal EU tensions and internal EU policies where there's been concerns in the past. We don't want to upset the French. We don't want to upset the Germans, the Scandinavian countries, and Netherlands and countries where we have important allies, but we don't want to be seen as getting too involved with EU policies, especially when we can see the foreign minister is very interested in restoring ties with the EU that have been damaged in recent years under Borrell. There's a new EU foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas from Estonia, who's quite friendly to Israel, and I think Israel's trying to take advantage of that. Therefore, we should avoid being seen as being involved in tensions between the EU and Hungary.
Estonia, again, one of these countries that we are constantly talking about in this conversation. It's these countries that aren't necessarily of the liberal, ultra-liberal Western mindset. So do you see any downside in Israel creating, valuable ties to some of these Eastern European countries that aren't necessarily of the liberal mindset at the end of the day?
So if I was going to look at any costs, it could be, we want to be careful we're not giving a pass to anti-Semitic elements. There's obviously anti-Semitic elements across Europe, across the world. It expresses itself differently in different countries, but in Hungary, there's absolutely anti-Semitism, and we don't want to give a pass. We don't want to be deaf to the concerns of the large local Jewish community, which certainly has concerns beyond the Chabad, but the rest of the Hungarian Jewish community certainly has concerns with the government. So we want to make sure that we are representing concerns of the Jewish community as well. We don't want to be seen as, again, taking a side. We want to say whoever is supportive of us and is within certain norms, we are going to work with you. A case could certainly be made in these more liberal Western European countries. Where I would ask you this: where can Jews walk around more comfortably? In Budapest or in Paris or in London?
I would say Budapest.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, and obviously the food there is phenomenal as well. So just making that point.
No question. So if we're concerned about anti-Semitism, it seems like there's a different but a perhaps more severe anti-Semitism problem on the streets of many of these cities. So it's not like, Budapest is probably one of the safest places in Europe to walk around for a Jew. So we should not be blind to that, but the fact that they have not allowed pro-Palestinian protests in any, or anti-Semitic or pro-Hamas protests in any meaningful way, I think has to be appreciated. And we should not be alienating allies, and we should make sure that those who stand with us in our time of need, we're going to stand with them. And we are going to recognize that. And those who try to block weapons while we're fighting Hamas, or those who try to twist the rules of war or make up new rules, humanitarian rules, or new definitions of genocide while we're fighting just to target Israel, well, there's going to be cost there as well. We're not going to cut off ties necessarily, but we're certainly going to move closer and hopefully provide a material benefit for countries that stand beside us.
There's always the difference between what is official and what is in practice. And for example, in Budapest, if you go to one of the flea markets, you'll find Nazi paraphernalia. It's just out there. There's portraits of Hitler. There's all sorts of Nazi symbols that you can purchase. And Yaakov has purchased in the past, my assistant who lives in Budapest. And it's just out there in the open. And yet, at the same time, it is very easy to walk around as a Jew, and quite safe overall to walk around as a Jew. There are strong ties between the Jewish community and the government, especially the Chabad wing of the Jewish community, but that's maybe another conversation. And it is interesting, a little worrisome at the same time, that this Nazi paraphernalia is just out there. I don't think people think it's ironic when they're selling it. So that does have me a little bit worried, Lazer. What do you think about that?
And I would say even beyond that, it's also how Hungary, or how this government and its allies remember the Holocaust, and the fact that they minimize the collaboration of the regime, and they honor people who were proud, outspoken anti-Semites, and minimize the fact, that Hungary took part in taking land from neighboring countries, and did not allow Jews to serve in the armed forces. They served in these labor battalions that many thousands of Jews died in, and had anti-Semitic laws, and could have stopped the wholesale slaughter of Hungarian Jews in Auschwitz, but didn't, and actually cooperated. And I think it's quite clear that had they resisted, the situation would be very different. So we cannot let countries minimize their own complicity in the Holocaust. And, it's an issue that's gotten in the way of our ties with Poland. The situation in Poland is quite different, but because there was not a collaborationist regime in Poland at all. But we should not let countries off the hook. But I think we can have these difficult conversations while maintaining positive ties and common interests. And there's a way to do that, but we should not allow these to go by the wayside. I'll say, yesterday, there was an event 25 years since the Stockholm Declaration, which created the IHRA, the IRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. It was at the British Embassy, the Swedish Embassy, and the U.S. Embassy also sponsored it. The last surviving fighter from the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was there speaking. So, just that underlines how important it is to make sure that the true story of the Holocaust gets across, and we point fingers at who we need to. And it doesn't need to affect our ties today if our interlocutors in Europe take a full faith and introspective look at this and are able to learn the lessons moving forward. There are concerns in Hungary about that, and that should be part of the conversation between Netanyahu and Orban.
Lazer, so now we've come to the most important part of the conversation. So I'm placing my order for sweet paprika and also hot paprika, and I expect it to be fulfilled before Passover. So are you my man?
I think I can do that. I'm going to be looking at the palenka, the schnapps that they have there, and I'll have to drink that probably before Passover as well. But if anyone can do it, I can.
Really, really, really sharp, those schnapps. Okay, Lazer, have a great trip, and I look forward to seeing you in the office again next week.
Thank you. Have a great weekend. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Friday Focus. Please check out another installment next week. This episode was produced by the Podwaves and edited on video by Thomas Gersh. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next week, Shalom.